welcome to the Knock Knock Episode 4 Q&A. My name is Jason B. Jones, and I'm here with my brother and our communications director, Simon Jones. Hey, Simon.
Hey, how's it going?
Good, man. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this Q&A episode. I hope that everyone had an awesome Thanksgiving. Simon and I had a really great Thanksgiving with our family over at my mother-in-law's house, and we had all the food. It was really great and a really sweet time. You know, as I've been thinking about Thanksgiving, obviously I imagine you as well have been thinking about what you're thankful for this week. And for me, this whole podcast has been just a lesson in thankfulness. From my team of volunteers that I mention at the end of every episode to everyone who has given their time to be interviewed and contribute to this story. Huge thankfulness to the Starkville Police Department for their continued effort to try to solve this case and to keep it active and in the public eye. And to both the Jones and the Krigler family and their commitment to finding justice for Betty and Catherine. And Simon, man, huge thank you to you for walking through this with me.
Absolutely. I was thinking about it over Thanksgiving, and it takes so many moving parts, this podcast, in order to make this happen and in order to tell a story in a meaningful way. And it takes a lot of people. Jason has said before, it takes a village, and it's so true. And to have all of that effort and all of the volunteers come together to do something this special, it's really something very, very important to be thankful for.
Simon, I think we've talked about this before, is that if we do a podcast again, we want to make it much less serious, because this is also, financially, there's a lot that goes into this that we're sort of bootstrapping, out of our own pockets. But I think what I didn't take into account when we started this was just the emotional capital that goes into this. Because when you're talking about something so raw and so personal, and you're dealing with not only your own emotions, but the emotions of those around you, it can just take a lot out of you week to week. It's just a lot to think. This stays on my mind during the week. The details and the story and how we're progressing this, and keeping something so heavy and so dark on your mind all the time can be really taxing. Simon, I don't know if you've experienced that as well.
Yeah, it takes a toll, especially when it comes together and you take a step back and you try to listen to it objectively, like our listeners do, and it puts stuff in a new light. You consider things you never considered before, or you look at it in a different way, and we've talked about that in previous episodes. And there are times where it's been hard thinking about that. It's hard thinking about why we're doing this, and what, you always think about what could have been or what should have been, and you think in the abstract, and you go down that rabbit hole. And that's when sometimes it gets hard for me is, what if we weren't doing this? Would she be with us? And if so, what would our world look like now? And what experiences what memories would we have in place of tragedy? Sometimes that's hard for me.
Yeah. Yeah. We were, just before we hit record today, we were talking about when you really start to think about the murder, it's not, we watch a lot of shows. We were even just thinking about Stranger Things season 2, because we both watched that and we're big fans of that show. And, there are people that get killed in that show that you don't bat an eye at. You're thinking that's part of the story. That's what moves the narrative along. But when you're really dealing with murder in your own life, it's not as simple as that. And so, Simon, I know that you were talking about that earlier. Just jump in. What did you think? What were your thoughts about episode 4? What do you think about who was Catherine Krigler?
Yeah, 2 things that were really impactful to me as finally getting to tell our audience about this this chance connection that came about in really such a beautiful way, between you and your wife Rebecca and your mother-in-law Rebecca's mom, knowing Juki, kind of showing how all that came together. I was pretty excited for that, to share that with the audience. And I also liked how we were able to share more about the house. I feel like so much through the podcast, the house has been just a murder scene, right? And we know that they live there, but for the most part, the audience, without being there and without seeing family photos or hearing, spending time with the family, it was just a house. And it's important to our story because it's been the scene of the murder, right? And it's a focus for that reason. But in this episode, we learned more about what it meant before the events. Before it was a crime scene, it was a place of love, and it was a sanctuary of memories, fond memories that a family really had there, and years, decades, perhaps, of fond, loving memories that are still with people today. We heard that people in the Krigler family could never return to the house because, and I feel like I would do the same thing if I had decades of memories in a loving home and then something so horrible happened. I would have to process it like it burnt down, like there was a fire and there's nothing left there to see.
Yeah, I mean the Kriglers sold that house shortly after the events took place, and a lot of the account that you hear from Shep and Anne are. And I hadn't even really thought about this. And again, unless you go through this yourself, you just don't think about the aftermath. Is Shep and Anne were responsible for trying to clean that house up. So when they talk about all of the blood that was there, that's because it was their responsibility to go in and then try to make that house. They had to return that house to where it was before the crime took place. And it was through that they realized they couldn't do it anymore. They couldn't go back there. And they sold it to a gentleman who lives there still today. And, in the trailer of the podcast that we released back Memorial Day, Jason Adams and I, who is a film director, went out there and we knocked on the door and I had to explain who I was. And he was like, yeah, come on in, look at whatever you want, take as much video as you want. He talked to us about how he had bought the house from the Kriglers and he's tried to sell it over the years and no one wants to buy it because of what happened there. In the state of Mississippi, you have to disclose what happened in that house. And so he lives there. And when you're in there, it just feels like a house. I mean, it feels not a lot has changed since the 90s in that home. Still has the same wallpaper. It still has a lot of the same fixtures. And it feels just like a normal house. And I think that what is so sad when you hear from Shep, who is who's quite old now, is that he has those memories. You're right, Simon. He has those fond memories of being in that home. And for Juki, that's where, she visited her granny. And now, you're right. I mean, to her, that place is just a smoking crater at this point. She can't ever go back there.
Yeah. Putting it into context, I mean, if you're listening to this, think about your grandmother and think about her home. And perhaps, you had a grandmother and grandfather. And there's a good chance that they had a kind, loving, nurturing home. I know that we did. My mom's parents, back in Houston, they're no longer with us, but we had a loving, amazing grandma and grandpa house that we
looked forward to going to.
Yeah. And thankfully, nothing tragic ever happened there. And those memories are still well intact. Probably for Jason even more because he's older, but I can't imagine going back to that house to being responsible for, cleaning a crime scene like that, and the damage that would have done to my childhood memories there. It would have been awful.
Yeah. Well, back to the idea of like this chance connection, Simon. I know that later on in this episode, you're gonna be interviewing my wife Rebecca to talk a little bit about how this all happened.
Yeah. So with mentioning the Juki connection with Jason, Rebecca, and Rebecca's mom, I thought it would be really awesome if we could hear from Rebecca for the first time in this podcast. And we're going to find out some more about her perspective and her opinions about the podcast and the things that happened and how they happened. And we're going to hear from her more later on.
That's awesome. Let's just go through a few updates that I wanted to give our Knock Knock community since our last episode. First of all, on Friday, November 10th, I had the privilege to speak at an event called Creative Mornings about the Knock Knock podcast and the process of creating the show and where we're going. It was so great to have some of you join us, and we had a really great Q&A afterwards. I think it's awesome. That's why we do these Q&As, is because it's really cool for me to hear the questions that you guys have, because it really affects how we take the story and what we address. And we had a great time that morning and heard some questions from the audience that we'll share with you guys soon. Just to give you a synopsis of what Creative Mornings is, Creative Mornings is this global organization with chapters literally around the world, and their concept is really simple. It's just having people together in the local creative community for breakfast and a short talk one Friday morning a month. And the speakers are selected by each chapter based on a global theme. So across the world, every month, all these Creative Morning chapters are talking about the same thing. They're just talking about it differently based on the speaker that they have. And I was having coffee with the head of the Nashville chapter, Alicia, a while back, and was telling her about what we were doing with this podcast. And as I wrapped up, she said, "You won't believe this, but November's global theme is death." And it was like, oh my gosh, there's certain things in life that just sort of like dovetail and it was meant to be. And as soon as she said that, we both were like, yeah, we need to talk about the podcast to this Nashville creative community. And they recorded both audio and video of my talk, and we're going to be posting it soon as a special episode. And I think that you guys will really enjoy it, because we talk a lot about what happened, some of the things we talked about in the pre-production episodes, but we go into really how we've come to this point and where we are going forward. Also, I wanted to announce this. There was a news segment that posted on Tuesday, November 22nd, out of WTVA, which is the NBC affiliate that services Tupelo and Columbus and kind of all of North Mississippi. And it's a piece on Betty and Catherine, and it features Bill Lott, and he talks about his investigation a little bit, and it really starts this conversation about familial DNA research, which we're going to be covering in depth in future episodes. Simon, you saw it. Like, I just think that it's really great that we're continuing to see 27 years later, this story continue to come up.
Yeah, people are taking notice, and importantly, part of that is media is taking notice too, and it kind of stirs the fire. We want to keep it going. We don't want this to be reduced to embers. Again, if we can help it. So a lot of what keeps that conversation and the awareness going is media attention, and it's just how our world works. And so every time that we see something like this in the media that's reaching hundreds and thousands of people, we definitely get excited about it, and we're definitely going to mention it.
Yeah, and whether we're involved or not, we weren't involved in this piece. That's neither here nor there. I've said this before, is that what I'm not qualified as a news person to really tell this story and broadcast it through these news channels, but anytime those come up, man, we want to celebrate those and we want to share them with you. And so we'll post this short news segment on our Facebook group, so that those of you that are interested in continue to keeping up with the case, you can have this. And there's some things that they talk about that we haven't talked about in the podcast yet. So I think that you'll find it really interesting. Also, in this past week or two, our show, which is really exciting, has been also posted on both TuneIn and Spotify. And they choose their shows. It's not just like you can just post it there. Both TuneIn and Spotify have chosen to put our show on their platform, which is awesome. And so, those of you that use Spotify, it's really easy now to go in and follow our show through what you're already using. And those of you that are big TuneIn fans, you can check us out there too. And we have, I want to tell you guys about this so bad, but we've got more exciting developments and opportunities that are on the horizon, and we'll be talking more about those soon. But it's there's some things that really could be a big deal about moving this story forward. So thank you so much for your support. And we'll just keep on going. Let's jump into some questions from the Knock Knock community.
Hello, guys. My name is Kathy Price. I'm from Oklahoma. And I'm calling because I've been thinking a lot about the intruder coming to the side door versus the front or the back. And it just feels like to me he must have known that this side door would be answered and was commonly answered. And going back with the sketches, I think if I were investigating this case, I would be comparing those sketches to members of the church that Catherine was involved in, any group activity that Catherine was involved in, because it seems like the perpetrator was focused on her, and maybe Mama Betty was just, unfortunately, and it's so tragic, but in the way. And even maybe the baseball team that was involved in their lives, and just compare those photos with men that were part of those groups and see if anything comes from that. And especially with, you have the last names, it may or may not be, to look at the last names and compare those. So those are just some of my thoughts so far. I'll keep listening intently. Thank you, and I really hope that this leads to justice for Betty and Kathy.
Kathy, thank you so much for your question. And I just love how you're really digging in and systematically thinking through how we can find leads and how we can move this forward. And, Bill Lott today and the detectives that covered the case back in 1990, they have really gone over the top to try and figure out who did this. I mean, the reason that we have those names today, Hicks and Devine, is because Bill is continuing to test that DNA against the CODIS database using new techniques and new technology. Obviously, DNA research is much different today than it was in 1990. And so the more that we can do with that DNA, the closer we get to figuring out who this was. And so even back from 1990, they were scouring all of Starkville to try and figure out who did this. And, it's interesting in that news episode that we'll post in the Knock Knock Facebook group. So if you're not a part of that, be sure to request to join. We'll have it posted there. But Bill literally pulls out like a really thick binder or a really thick folder of all the original suspects. I mean, there were a ton, and all of them were disqualified based on DNA. So, all of the baseball team has been looked at. All of the students at that time have been looked at. All of the sort of the surrounding people have been looked at. But Kathy, I think you're right. I think that the perpetrator using that side door. Because there's not a lot of distance. Simon, you haven't been there yet, but I think it'll be really good when you see it, is there's not a lot of distance between the front door and the side door because the house is really small. So the front door, between that and the side door is just maybe like, I don't know, a few yards. But it is, there was a house next to it. So I imagine the side door was a lot darker than the front door. The front door was a lot more visible. So that would be one reason why the perpetrator would go to the side door. But Kathy, you're right. That would be the entrance that the family would use. And so it's easy to draw a conclusion that this guy may have had familiarity with this home or with the Krigler family. And those are all the leads that the police department are continuing to pursue. So continue to think like that. Let's continue to think about all of those ways to find this guy. And if you have any leads or any thoughts, please feel free to reach out to the Starkville Police Department, as they are welcoming any leads or any thoughts to try to bring closure and justice to this case. Thanks so much.
Hi, my name is Debbie. I live in Gainesville, Florida. I'm approximately the age of your grandmother, Betty, when she was killed. What a horrifying thing for you and your family. My only comment, I've been listening. I wish I had a tip. And I only comment, and I'm sure you'll hear this a lot. I had watched the news this week about a young man that killed a young woman, and they used DNA. Of course, this was a recent crime, to come up with a composite picture. They, used his DNA to determine his skin color and his hair, his eyes, etc. And it propelled the young man to turn himself in when he saw the picture. And I am hoping that there was some DNA left at the scene, that maybe the same process could be used to help solve this murder. Maybe if they could use that, come up with a composite type picture, compare it to the artist sketches that Catherine gave, and that I know was reproduced in a more update manner. Anyway, that's just my thought, and I'm sure everybody else is thinking the same thing. And I hope that this person is found and brought to justice for a little peace and closure for your family. So I know that would be difficult no matter what. Anyway, I have enjoyed the podcast. Great work, and I hope somebody has a tip. Thank you.
Debbie, thank you so much for calling in. This again, Simon, and I bet you feel the same way. I'm just blown away that people are, dissecting the case and really trying to figure out, they're just being very strategic in their thinking about how to move this forward. That's just so humbling to me that people are caring enough to really dig in and think about those strategies. So, one of the things that you said that I thought was really great was, digging into DNA and using these new technologies. And we're going to be talking a lot about that in the future. Sergeant Lott is really in this news piece that aired. One of the things that Sergeant Lott said that really broke my heart was that he says he feels like a failure for not solving this case. And when I had a chance to ride with Sergeant Lott around Starkville, and we're going to share a lot of that in the next episode, which is going to be called The Investigation, he shared with me all of the extreme work that he's been doing, the classes that he takes at night. This is not his regular day-to-day job. He's spending time in his nights and weekends because this case haunts him. And not just in a way that he's just recklessly trying to solve it. He's continuing to study and be on the cutting edge of DNA research and speaking with experts and trying to figure out how we can leverage this technology to really find out what happened. And so I told him that he's a hero to us and our family, and the work that he's doing is not going unnoticed. And I'm excited to, anything that I can do to help him be able to do this better. That's my goal. I never want to get in the way of what he's doing. I only want to compliment and support what he's doing and the good work that the Starkville Police Department's doing. So what's really great, and I'm glad you brought this up, is that Catherine was able to give a very detailed description of the perpetrator to a sketch artist, and that has continued to be re-rendered as the years have gone by. And the better we get at being able to render these composites, and age progress it. All of those things, if you're ever interested, they're up on our website. If you'd like to see the progression of these sketches, it's in one of the episode folders. And so, I love your thoughts around that. Anything that we can pull from that DNA is going to be a tool to trying to figure out who this is. And we'll be talking more in future episodes about advances in DNA and how we may be able to help as a community really figure out new tools to be able to use towards finding justice for Betty and Catherine. Thank you so much for your question.
Next, we have a website question that was posted on our discussion forum. Eliza Day asked, are episodes in the future going to delve into the crime a bit deeper, or will the podcast focus on the women and their lives? I haven't heard the episode that went up today, by the way. Looking forward to it. Yeah,
Eliza Day, that's a great question. Thank you so much for asking. As we've talked about it, the podcast for me has two really distinct purposes. One is getting to know these two women. And that a lot of that honestly is for me, and a lot of that is for me to both honor the Jones family and to honor the Krigler family by telling more about these women. I think that it's really easy to define these women by the tragedy that happened to them at the end of their lives, rather than the women that they were and the lives that they led. And so far, you're right. A lot of it has been about these women and their lives. Although we've put a lot of the details of what had happened, we've sort of sprinkled that throughout. But after this episode, after episode 4, which is Who Was Catherine Krigler, we take a really we take a 90-degree turn where we are now going to focus almost exclusively on the crime, the investigation, and how we can move this forward. So it was important to me as we were telling this that the community that we were building really cared about these women. Because it's really easy. I don't know about you, but for me, especially with the increased popularity in true crime podcasts, it's really easy for me to gloss over. This is another murder. This is another crime. It's, my capacity to care about all of these crimes diminishes because there's so much of a saturation of these stories. And so it was really important to me as a true crime podcast fan for me to look at the story that we're telling and say, it's important for us to really paint a picture of who this happened to. And now I feel like we've really done that. And now it's going to be time to really dig in and talk about what happened and figure out how we can solve this crime, or that we can at least assist in really telling that story to as many people as we can, because I believe that someone out there knows something. And the more that we talk about this story and the more that we spread awareness of what happened, I think the closer we get to finding out what really happened on September 3rd, 1990. Thank you so much for your question. Let's take a quick break. While living in Ethiopia, some friends of mine witnessed firsthand the consequences of extreme poverty. They saw how Ethiopian women, in an effort to provide for themselves and their families, were forced to make unthinkable choices just to survive. These friends realized they wanted to give these women another choice, one that would provide them the opportunity to earn a living. It was from this experience that Fashionable was born. This movement started with a collection of hand-woven scarves, of which my wife has many, and has grown to include handmade leather bags and jewelry, apparel, shoes, and most recently, a premium denim line, lovingly crafted by women who have overcome extraordinary circumstances. We're so honored to partner with Fashionable and offer our listeners 15% off their first order. Go to livefashionable.com and use the discount code KNOCK15 at checkout. Again, Visit livefashionable.com today to help bring opportunity and choice to these amazing women.
Rebecca, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Simon. Glad to be here.
So I just want to start off right out the door, say, what do you think about the podcast so far?
Oh, man, I am so proud of Jason and all the hard work he's done and all the work behind the scenes. It's been, gosh, it feels like years coming, definitely months. A lot of our dialogue around the house is about this podcast. Mm-hmm. And we go and hang out with friends, it's about the podcast. And so it's a little all-consuming, but he has done such a great job. He's put together such a great team behind the scenes to come together and really support each area of this podcast, this adventure we're on. So I'm very proud of him.
That's great. And I've wanted to ask you for a long time now, do you remember the first time Jason told you about Mama Betty and her story and her tragic death?
I don't remember the first time. I remember when we were dating, we obviously talk about family, and you talk about siblings and extended family and grandparents and aunts and uncles. And I remember him not having any grandparents living. I don't recall him telling me exactly how they passed away. But as we got closer to getting married, and then, of course, at the beginning of our marriage, what happened kind of came to fruition. We talked about it.
Yeah. Well, I know that earlier this year, you and Jason took a drive down to Starkville. It was kind of the beginning of the production of the podcast, where we've heard some of the interviews earlier in episodes. So what was it like experiencing where the story actually happened?
Yeah. So Starkville is this really sweet little town. It reminded me a lot of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, which is where I went to college, MTSU, and a little bit like Franklin, Tennessee. Just really cute little downtown square, charming area. You know, there's got to be a little barber shop down there. There's got to be a little Five and Dime and a diner. It just had all the really cute aspects of it. And then you turn the corner and there's this huge college campus that's beautiful. Grounds are immaculate. So it's a little bit of a stark contrast from, this quaint little town to this booming college campus. But I think for me, in learning the details of the story, it had this sort of like cloud over it, a little bit of a haunted sort of vibe to it. And I think a little bit of that was probably my perception of it, and maybe what I was expecting it to be, was this haunted place. And honestly, at night, I was a little bit freaked out driving around at night, especially when we were driving past the house where everything occurred. I'm easily affected by ghost stories, if you will. And but as a town, man, it was really sweet and really cute. And we met a lot of people who knew Jason's grandmother. We bumped into people. We had gone to or been invited to go to a baseball game. We ended up sitting in Mama Betty's seats up at the top of the center of the stadium, and got naturally surrounded by people that we felt like probably knew her, people who were connected to the team, to the campus in some capacity, and then people who had been coming to games for years. So we just assumed that they probably knew her. So we started conversation. And the reaction of those people who we did not know, they were strangers to us, when Jason said, "Oh, I'm Betty Jones's grandson," was unbelievable. I mean, the immediate look on their faces where it took them back to 30 years ago when they were sitting next to her in those seats. And so it was kind of it took that sort of eerie feeling into this really beautiful like family moment. So it's kind of cool.
So in the last episode, we learned more about how this kind of came full circle in Jason and our lives when you came into the picture, and as a result, there's this scene now where we're at a bridal shower and where Juki, Catherine's granddaughter, comes into the picture and a connection is made. So I wanted to ask, you knew Juki for years before Jason, in fact, but it was by her married name, Juki Holt. How did you first meet her?
Yeah. And forgive me if I slip up because I've always known her as Julia. Juki is a name that has come along, I think, in her story, her life, since I originally met her. So when I met her, she was Miss Holt. She was a school teacher. And I think I was probably 15. And at that point, my mom had started teaching at the same school with Julia. In fact, I think Julia maybe came to the school a few years after my mom started teaching. So I would have met Julia maybe when I was probably 17, 18. So junior, senior in high school. And I had come to my mom's school where she's teaching pretty regularly after I was let out of school. I would drive over, have someone drop me off at my mom's school. And I think because maybe Julia and I are a little bit closer in age, and she was new to the school, and she was so fun, and we always had a lot to talk about. We just kind of naturally connected. And plus, I was, the apple of my mother's eye. So she kind of wanted to show me off to her coworkers. So I spent a lot of time there in my teenage years. And those teachers really did see me grow up from, a teenager up until a young woman when I was getting married and my mom was hosting my bridal shower at the school.
So kind of a follow-up to that, when this all came together, right? We painted this scene at the bridal shower, and this all came together, and that realization was had. What was your reaction? And kind of following up to that, what ways, if any, did this change or impact your friendship with Juki present day?
Yeah, it definitely impacted it in a very unique way, to the point where we're kind of extended family. And I think that was already there in a sense from, I believe that Julia called my mother her mom. My mom was a few years, quite a bit older than her. And so my mother had a little bit of that nurturing sort of role already with Julia. Yeah. Mm-hmm. As a coworker. And so there was already this sort of like family vibe already built in. And now to really be connected on the other side of my family, my in-laws, it was just a little bit more solidified. So when I found out about the connection, I think that was probably the really like firm introduction of the story of Betty Jones. Mm-hmm. I don't think before then, I don't recall before then really getting the details about that. So yeah. I think that's where it was locked in. Like, oh my gosh, this is unbelievable that I'm kind of the connector of these two families again. Like for the second time, these two families are coming together.
Yeah, and years leading up to that, prior to you coming in the picture, I mean, Jason's talked about this. It was almost taboo. Like we just didn't talk about it. There's so much pain there. It just didn't come up. And hearing you now, it makes sense that Jason wouldn't talk about this a lot back then.
Yeah.
Because it was so unresolved and there was no movement and it hurt. And so for it to come up, I feel like that might have been, even though we're talking about years back now, that may have in some ways been the spark that led to where we're at now.
Yeah, I absolutely think it was. I think that was kind of the aha moment, if you will, that the story needs to be told in a unique way. And that was 12 years ago, over 12 years ago. And so if you can imagine all of us kind of, especially Jason and his mom, kind of sitting on that excitement that like, oh my gosh, we cannot believe that we're connected in this way.
Yeah, they were floored.
And yeah, it was a big deal. So it's kind of cool to 12 years later to kind of like burst the bubble almost and like get this out there and share the connection.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad we could. And I want to thank you so much for all of your help. You may not know, those listening may not know, but Rebecca does so much behind the scenes. Just to name a few things, she's our sponsor liaison. She works with our public relations, and she is really an invaluable emotional support to the family during this endeavor. She's always there and always supporting all of our efforts and the cohesion that has to take place. So, Rebecca, from me to you, and certainly on Jason's behalf, thank you so much for all that you do in this process. It really does mean a lot, and we sincerely appreciate it. Is there anything else that you want to say to the Knock Knock community before we go?
Oh man, the part of this process that I'm not involved in is a lot of the data. And occasionally I'll ask Jason, hey, how many downloads have we gotten or how many listeners do we have? And, podcasts are not like, Jason and I live very much in the music industry world. It's not like a song download where it's, 1-to-1. One download equals one person. Podcasts are a little bit different. So when we receive, we have thousands and thousands of downloads. It's just, man, it's amazing to know that many people are interested in this story that is so personal to us. So it's almost like, talk about family. Those people are really part of our family now. So it's really cool to know that there's that many people listening and supporting and interested and curious and, entertained even.
Well, thank you again so much, Rebecca, for being with us. Let's take another quick break.
If there's one thing I've learned about Betty through this process, it's that her life was dedicated to giving back. I know she would have loved organizations like Thistle Farms. At first glance, Thistle Farms is a world-class provider of natural home and body products. In the summer, their bug spray is a must. But what is truly amazing about these items are the people who make them. All of Thistle Farms products are lovingly crafted by women, survivors of trafficking, prostitution, and addiction. You see, beneath the surface, what Thistle Farms really is a place that provides safe housing, economic independence, and a strong community of advocates for these women. Take a minute to visit thistlefarms.org and learn more about this amazing organization. And while you're there, use the discount code KNOCK15 for 15% off your first order. That's thistlefarms.org, where love is the most powerful force for change in the world. Thanks again to Rebecca for coming on and sharing a little bit about her side of the podcast and her thoughts about episode 4 and just giving us some more context to how she fits in this whole kind of craziness. I think what's really awesome is how supportive she's been and how invested she's been in what we're trying to do. And Simon, thanks so much for interviewing her and making her a part of this special Q&A episode.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Simon, remind our listeners how they can connect with you and contribute to what we're doing here.
So we have a few different ways if you want to connect and get involved. First, we have our Knock Knock Facebook group. You can find us on Facebook and request to join this group. It is private, so you do have to send a request, but we'll absolutely let you in. And that way you can connect with other people who are heavily invested in the podcast and who are talking about it, and you can have a dialogue with them. It's just a great way to connect.
And we'll be posting that WTVA news episode exclusively to the Knock Knock Facebook group today, so that you can watch that and learn a little bit more about the crime.
Yeah, so find us on Facebook and send us a request to join, and we're happy to let you in. We also have our Knock Knock discussion board on our website. You can find us at knockknockpodcast.com/discussion. On that page, you can see other people have posted questions or topics, and if you post something, we'll respond to you as quick as we can. Sometimes it takes a few days, and I'm sorry about that, but please don't hesitate if you have a question or you just want to make a comment. please feel free to do so. We also, if you want to be featured on a Q&A episode, you can leave us a voicemail. Our voicemail number is 1-888-57-BETTY. That's 1-888-57-BETTY. If you call that number, you can leave a voicemail, leave your question, leave your thoughts, your comments, and we will feature you on a future Q&A episode. And last but not least, we have a contact form on our website. So if you're not into kind of a public discussion format, you can email us essentially through a contact form on our website. So again, that's knockknockpodcast.com.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks again for joining us and for contributing to this Q&A episode. To join the Knock Knock community, be sure and connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Knock Knock Pod. There you can ask questions, leave comments, or just say hi. We've also set up a voicemail at 1-888-57-BETTY. If you have comments or questions, or you'd like to be a part of the show, please call and leave a message. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you download podcasts. Reviews are key to keeping Knock Knock on the charts, where people can find our show. Knock Knock is produced by Chris Cerrone and me. Special thanks to the Knock Knock team: Lacey Urcioli, Rebecca Jones, Jason Adams, Simon Jones, Cole Flynn, Colleen Jones, and Maggie Thomas. We'll be back soon with our next full episode, so please share the podcast with your friends and family. Thanks again for subscribing to the Knock Knock Podcast.